Okay, folks, I guess we'll get started. Thanks for your patience. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Opsasnick, and I have written an article entitled Coffee, Confusion, and Jim Morrison, the Forgotten History of Hip Coffee Houses and Beatnik Poets in the Nation's Capital. This article appears in the current issue of Beltway Poetry Quarterly, which is an online internet publication. We have copies for everybody. They're in these folders. If you want any extras, we do have a whole stack of them here. What we're going to do this evening is I'm going to talk a little bit about the content of the article, and then we'll have a question and answer session, or if you have any comments or stories or anything you'd like to say about the Beat Generation or the DC Beatniks or the nightclub scene of that era or anything you like. And then we're going to have a reception and just hang out until Ellie decides to kick us out. I guess we'll be here till like 9:30 or 10, so I hope everybody will stick around and say hello, and it should be a lot of fun. Before we get started, I want to thank a few people. I want to thank Kim Roberts, editor of Beltway Poetry Quarterly, for publishing this article. I also want to thank Ellie for the owner of the Kensington Bookshop. 2 years ago, in the summer of 2006, when my biography on Jim Morrison, the Lizard King, was here, came out. The first public presentation I ever gave was right here at Kensington Bookshop. Ellie's been a huge supporter of mine for many years, and I appreciate everything you've done for me, Ellie. Thanks for hosting this event. And I want to thank all of you folks for coming this evening. I know that weeknights can be tough. You have family issues, jobs, you have to battle rush hour traffic and everything else. But I do appreciate everybody coming out here this evening. Basically, my first book, Capital Rock, came out in December of 1996, and that was it was a comprehensive cultural history of Washington, D.C. area rock and roll. It covered the years 1951 to 1976. Since that time, I've been continuously involved in documenting Washington, D.C.'s popular music scene with a special interest in local rock and roll prior to the mid-70s. And I'm still doing it to this day. Currently, I'm working on a project that's going to expand and update Capital Rock. I've taken the manuscript and I'm writing around it. And this project is going to go all the way back to the early 1900s. It's going to document the vaudeville era, the orchestra era, and then heavy emphasis on the 50s and 60s, which is my favorite period. And then I cut it off right at the nation's bicentennial. And we'll give it a new title, and hope to go with a major publisher. That's a few years down the road if I can actually get around to finishing it. The one thing I noticed in researching local DC rock and roll history, the popular music history in general in DC, there are certain musical trends and distinct social and cultural events that kind of characterize each decade. Again, vaudeville was very popular in the theaters in the early 1900s, throughout the 1920s, and the nightclubs kind of came in after Prohibition was repealed in 1933. Things kind of exploded. All the restaurants and bars opened up. You had all different types of music throughout the city. But it built up to, in the 40s, you had what I call the orchestra era. When you look at the DC nightclubs, you had all types of different music nightclubs in DC in all different areas, but the larger nightclubs, the more popular ones, like the Casino Royal and the Blue Mirror and the Lotus on 14th Street, Paul Young's Romany Room on 13th Street, Club Cavacos, which was over on H Street Northeast, Club Players at 5th and K. They all had these large big band orchestras that would play there, and really the emphasis was on bringing people in. They'd eat dinner, and then they'd have this big, wide floor show with different types of entertainment. You'd have the orchestra, you'd have usually some type of pop vocalist. Sometimes you have dancers, comedians, the whole thing. And that was in the 40s. In the 50s, everything changed drastically. And really the biggest change, of course, was the introduction of rock and roll music. Now, when you research the history of rock and roll, you'll see that a lot of these historians are going to say, well, rock and roll goes back to the 1930s and 40s, and they're going to point out these examples where the term rock and roll appeared in lyrics of certain rhythm and blues songs, sometimes in the title, and certainly it did, and you can even pick out songs from those eras where the blues performers are basically playing music that in style is rock and roll. However, I really believe that rock and roll originated when the term was appropriated to describe a separate classification of popular music. And that was done by a disc jockey named Alan Freed. In the summer of 1951, he had a radio program on station WJW in Cleveland, Ohio. He switched the title to the Moondog House. He was playing black R&B records on the station, and he started referring it to rock and roll. And really, that was the first time that rock and roll was used as a noun to describe a separate type of music. Previously, rock and roll, it was basically a blues euphemism for sex. And again, it did appear in certain song lyrics and so forth. But really, Alan Freed took the term rock and roll and started popularizing music. And it spread out throughout the country. In Washington, D.C., I found some very early examples of restaurants and nightclubs offering what they advertised as rock and roll bands. And I'm thinking of, in March of '52, the Hilltop Restaurant, which was on Marlboro Pike, down near Capitol Heights, Maryland, just over the D.C. line. They started booking a band called Murray Schaaf's Aristocrats. They were down from Philadelphia, and they advertised them as a rock and roll band. They were sort of more of a mixture of jazz and rock. A month later, the Hilltop advertised the Marveliers, which was another Philadelphia band, as a rock and roll band. There were other examples. There was a black R&B singer named George Eads, and when he started singing at Jack Rose nightclub on 11th Street Southeast in 1952, they advertised him as a rock and roll singer. Another was George Lowe. He originally was singing blues at the Crosstown Lounge in Mount Pleasant. Then he switched over to a place called Maynard's Restaurant, which was up in the 1500 block of 14th Street above Thomas Circle. And that building is still there today. It's Sam's Pawnbrokers. But when George Lowe was booked into Maynard's, they advertised him as a rock and roll singer. And I think the weirdest one I found, November of '52, there was a really bizarre little country and western restaurant. They referred to it at the time as a hillbilly nightclub, which back then was not a derogatory term. It was called the Covered Wagon Restaurant. It was at 1402 14th Street. The building was just torn down. They put something else up. For years it was the Logan Circle Dry Cleaners, but from the 30s to the 50s, they offered country and western music. The house band for a long time was Jimmy Dean, the Texas Wildcats. In his biography, Jimmy Dean actually talks about playing the Covered Wagon, and the owner, Lou Miller, when fights broke out, he'd grab a baseball bat and start swinging at everybody. And it was a really rough place. Well, they abruptly changed their format in November of '52. It was still owned by Lou Miller, but they booked a black rhythm and blues trio called the Three of Us Trio and advertised them as a rock and roll band. The Three of Us Trio were very popular in D.C. in the 50s and 60s. That was Charlie Kelly on sax, Clarence Stillard on guitar, and Lawrence Farrell on the drums. And the Covered Wagon is probably the last place you'd expect to see those guys. So you had the trend. You had rock and roll. It came in the 50s. June of '53, Bill Haley, in his comments at their D.C. debut at the Blue Mirror on 14th Street. A couple years later, Elvis Presley played the Wilson line. In the late 50s, you had Link Ray and the Raymen emerge. Link Ray came up from North Carolina in 1955, and they played a bunch of different nightclubs. They had a long run at the Rendezvous, which was down on 10th Street. And he was almost playing what could be called heavy metal back in the late 50s. So the music started changing, and then I started finding references to the Beat generation in Washington, D.C. around 1959.